Now, thank you all for coming. I think it's about time, and as I've always said, we want to start on time and end on time. So that is going to be true to today also. Last 3 weeks ago, I told you a story about 3 animals. That was the elephant, one, can you remember the other one?
The lion?
The lion and also the hyena. And the story then was the hyena and the lion were competing. You know, they were asking, who is the king of the jungle? And then, of course, the lion was saying that it's the king of the jungle. And then, of course, the hyena tricked the lion to go out to the jungle, ask all the other animals who is the king of the jungle. And you remember, of course, finally, when they went to the elephant, the lion was embarrassed seriously by the elephant. Remember it was, spinned like this, and it was splashed on the ground, came out embarrassed, and it was asking the lion, if you don't know, the elephant, if you don't know the answer, then of course you should say you don't know instead of fighting. So the whole message of that story, of course, was that great people don't go around shouting, oh, I'm great. So you kind of take it easy, you let others talk about it. So today, I want to take the story another step forward, but this time it's going to be between the hyena and a farmer. And I chose that theme because Shaq, of course, is, started as a farmer, and I thought that maybe
I got the calluses to show.
So I thought I should use that theme today to sort of extend the drama of the hyena, because it's a famous animal in my own culture back in Kenya. So one night, the hyena actually broke into the herd, where this farmer had a lot of goats and sheep and so forth. And the way our people lived, and including my grandfather, and I remember, of course, the way he lived with goats in the same hut made of mud and so forth. And then at the center of that hut, there was a big fire that was made to keep the animals warm. Somebody like Chuck would know this, goats like warmth, especially during winter, so that's important. So my grandfather, imagining this, he is sleeping, and of course the hyena comes into the herd and it wants to eat a goat, wants to kill a goat. So my grandfather wakes up and sees this animal coming in, and then decides to take one of the firebrand, the burning wood, and wants to scare these animals so that it goes away. And it appears that the hyena also thinks, this guy is crazy. I'm also going to, grab one of the firebrand, and I'm also going to scare this farmer away. So what happened actually, the hyena, instead of holding the other side which is not burning, it grabbed the side which was burning, and it went to climb. And my grandfather would tell me that this is where the hyena started saying, ooh, if you know how the hyena, the sound. But the message actually was more than that. It was saying that wise men actually know where to hold the firebrand. You don't go holding the burning side, you go to the side which is not burning. So, and then translated in this language, obviously we would say that there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. And usually we would use that to describe wise men. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very privileged to introduce a very wise man here. He has been with us actually since 1978, and if you have watched him, he has transitioned from coastal zone, Karaskana, where they did a lot of work, the sea weaves, and then now, of course, the pay or the modest, then going to pays, and then I think eventually they're going to go on to A's. So in those 35 years, there are a lot of twists and turns, and usually to pick the right thing requires a wise man. So a wise man always knows the right way to hold a firebrand. So without further ado, please help me welcome our speaker, McClain.
I want to thank Charles for inviting me to give this talk. I've been here 35 years, and it's been a very eventful 35 years, as he alluded to. I decided to talk more about the early years of my career, pre-CWIF, so to speak, because those were years that I think many of you can relate to, especially the younger scientists. You're trying to figure out how do you find your niche in the community, and there's a lot of trial and error, and you're wondering where you're going to get your next funding and what your next project's going to be. And so like probably many of the more senior people, we've been through all of that, and hopefully this talk will encourage you that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it's not obvious early on, but if you persevere, something will work out. And so this is sort of my story. I'm sure many of the more senior people can relate to it because they have similar stories. So I kind of struggled with what to call my talk, but I thought about it and I said, okay, here's a CWIF's image of the biosphere, ocean, whoops. And I grew up right in here someplace. Heart of America, it's kind of the breadbasket of North America. So that's where endless expanses of grass, okay? And so out in the ocean, we have, whoops, I keep hitting the wrong, these little microscopic plants are often referred to as the grass of the ocean because that's the base of the food web. Everything eats these and, you know, on up the food web to fish and everything else. And it's the same way with the Great Plains where you got all these grasslands, and that's sort of the base of the food web there. So anyway, I put a sub-caption on the title of, okay, now what do I do? Because I hit many junctures where I wondered, okay, now what happens? Because I don't know where I go next. And so I'll hit some of those throughout this little journey I'm going to discuss. So it all started in my hometown. This is Harrisonville, Missouri. It's about 4,000 people. It's not much bigger than that now after 50 years. But this is the courthouse. I thought it was a rather majestic building. It's built in 1897. It's still standing and it's still in use. Surrounding the courthouse is the town square. Every kind of shop you could possibly think of was on the square. And you could buy anything from crayons to cars within a block of the town square because that's where the commercial center was. And that's pretty standard geometry for small towns in the Midwest, courthouse, the county seat, and the square, and that's where commerce is. So come Saturdays, everybody from the country would roll into town and do their shopping, and the stores would stay open until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and it was a happening place. As a kid, town was basically a playground. You could go anywhere, anytime, as long as you were home for lunch and dinner, nobody cared. People didn't lock their doors at night, and many people just left their keys in the car. It was that kind of place. So one of the shops on the square was McClain Brothers Electric. My father grew up not too far from Harrisonville on a small farm. And after surviving the Great Depression and the war in Europe, he came back to Missouri, teamed up with one of his brothers, and got on with his life, so to speak. Electricity was coming to rural America finally, and so they were well positioned to take advantage of that as businessmen. So got through elementary school, night of my 8th grade graduation, and some of you have heard this story. I'm standing there with some of my buddies commiserating about, okay, where are we going to start playing ball tomorrow? Another summer of hanging out and playing baseball. And my father just strolls up and says, be at the shop at 8. And I looked at my mom and says, what's he mean? And she says, I believe you start work tomorrow. So promptly at 8 o'clock, I was delivered at the shop, and I was promptly issued a used pair of leather work boots, a used leather tool pouch, and a used set of hand tools. And for that summer and several summers after that, when I wasn't working construction for McClain Brothers Electric, I was working on my grandparents' farm. And I have to say that that first summer in particular was one of the best experiences of my life. I learned a lot. So went to high school at Harrisonville High. same school my mother attended many years earlier. I was a jock, played football. You had a choice of three: football, basketball, or track. So I played football because I wasn't very fast, but I could throw football. So I was, depending on the formation we were running, I was either a quarterback or a blocking back. And this photograph's a little misleading. That's from the senior album. Usually wasn't standing up. I was usually prone. The difference being, as a blocking back, I was usually on top of the pile. As a quarterback, it was the other way around. My favorite teacher was Mr. McClain. Took 4 years of math from him. And this is how he signed my senior album. Let's hope these 4 years pay off. And I was never quite sure what he meant by that. So anyway, second semester, your senior year rolls around, and you're thinking, okay, now what do I do? Where do I go from here? And I didn't really have a clue. But then we had a special assembly one afternoon in the school auditorium, and it was a show and tell on physics by a professor from a small college north of Kansas City called William Jewell College, and he was the department head of the physics department. And so he put on a 1-hour physics gee whiz show, and I thought, wow, that looks pretty cool. His name was Dr. Hilton, and at the end of the program, he invited all of us to come on up to physics night at William Jewell. And I said, well, I think I'll do that. So I went up and attended, and they had everybody who was majoring in physics, whether it was a freshman or a senior, manning experiments or some kind of display, and you could walk around and talk to them. And I thought that was pretty cool, so I decided, well, that's where I ought to go to school. So I ended up going to William Jewell College. This is Dr. Hilton here. He loved teaching physics. I mean, he was just one of the most enthusiastic people you could ever meet. And he actually got basically the Teacher of the Year award from the American Association of Physics Teacher in '78. But he just was a really great instructor. He was my advisor. And here he is at a conference in University of Arkansas in '67. This is the school here, small college, sits on a big hill. Very nice place. This is Marston Hall. This is where physics, biology, chemistry, and math were all housed. And that's where I spent a lot of time in 4 years, because most of my classes were in Marston Hall. I went back, I was invited back to give a talk in 1994. And at that time, there was a brand new extension to Marston Hall. This is part of it, the observatory, called White Science Center. Well, it turns out White stands for a guy named John White. John White was a fraternity brother of mine. I was a freshman, he was a senior. He was a math major, so he helped me through 2 semesters of freshman calculus. I knew him pretty well. Well, he graduated, went on to Wharton Business School, got his MBA, and from there became at least a millionaire, probably many times over. And so he basically paid for the extension. They named it after him. So got through 4 years. This is me on graduation day, May 1970. I'm on top of the world for a day. Then the old question is, now what do I do? Pops up again, because I wasn't quite sure. And I soon learned that no matter what you think you know, you never know enough. And so if I look a little cocky, it didn't last long. I had opportunities to go to graduate school in physics at the University of Missouri and University of Arkansas. The faculty had lined these up for me, but I just wasn't ready to make a commitment like that, so I declined and went back to Harrisonville and took a job with Anaconda Wire and Cable, and took some time to think about it. I've been in school for, 16 years. You kind of need a break. So anyway, I'm in Harrisonville, and I got bit by a bug. I call it the bike bug. And I was a fervent motorcyclist for 8 or 9 years after that. I loved working on them, and especially liked going on weekend trips. Typically, I just tape a map to the gas tank and pick out a 2-lane road and just take off and see where it went. And I just had that fever for quite a while, and I know there are some people here that have the same fever. John, are you here? Yeah, Mike. So anyway, that was a passion for quite a while. It subsided about the time I rolled over the big 3.0, but I had about 8 or 9 years of just really being into motorcycles. And as I said, Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper had nothing on me for a while, except they had much nicer looking motorcycles than I did. Okay, so I'm in Harrisonville. I'm wondering, okay, let's make a decision here. I got to do something. And then one day I ran across this issue of Scientific American. It was on the oceans. And I thought, wow, I'll read that. So I bought it and read it. And I'd never seen the ocean, never been on a ship, but I thought, this looks like just the ticket. So I started applying to graduate schools, and I got accepted at NC State, North Carolina State University. I'd never been west of Columbia, Missouri, or east of Columbia, Missouri, so this was a big deal. I told my folks, I said, look, I'm going to move to North Carolina and I'm going to study oceanography. And I remember my mom looked at me and says, well, that sounds interesting. What does an oceanographer do? And I looked at her and said, you know, I don't have a clue, but I guess I'm going to find out. So I moved to North Carolina and NC State, and Norden Wong, who many of you will probably remember, he worked at Wallops and Goddard for many years. He was my advisor. But I got to North Carolina, I thought I'd found the promised land. Great beaches, you got the mountains. Raleigh was this small southern city. It's nothing like it is now. It's really grown up and it's merged with Raleigh. Raleigh's merged with Chapel Hill and Durham, but back then there were 3 distinct towns, and it was just really a pleasant place to live. And fell in with a great bunch of first-year graduate students in marine science. Here some of them are. Here's some more. But the first summer I was there, it became clear that the graduate students would do all the field work. And so it was a lot of trial and error because none of us had ever done any research like this before. So this is our first big deployment out on the Outer Banks. We dubbed this vessel the RV Knowles after this gentleman here who was the PI on the study. He's one of the professors. So the idea was for our first big deployment, the Corps of Engineers had blasted an inlet into the one of the Outer Banks, and so he had a grant to study the tidal flow in and out of the inlet, what the transport was in and out. And so the concept was to go out there, stretch a rope across the inlet, tie the boat to the rope, and work your way back and forth, making measurements of the currents with this handy-dandy Bendix current meter. And so we put this rig together and we motor out to the inlet, and we're sitting there looking at it, and finally somebody blurts out, I think we're going to need a longer rope. Because the idea was the inlet was 100 yards wide, what was more like a quarter mile. So we fell back to the hotel. I came up with plan B, and eventually somebody got a master's degree out of the whole thing. But it was, we were learning on the fly, and so we had many trips to the coast, all over the coast, anywhere from Pamlico Sound down to the Cape Fear River. We were doing all kinds of studies, and so here's another deployment. Obviously not in summertime. This is a guy named Larry Bliven who works at Wallops and has for many years now, but we're actually out in somewhere. I don't know where this was, but it looks like it was kind of cold that day. So we did a lot of this, and probably one of the biggest events, my first year, my first semester at NC State was also David Thompson's first semester as a freshman. If you don't know who David Thompson is, he's probably the best basketball player that ever played in the ACC. and even better than Michael Jordan. And here he is. This is in the NCAA semifinal against UCLA, stuffing Bill Walton, who was quite a bit taller than he is. But this is a famous shot. They went ahead and won this game with UCLA, and then turned around and won the NCAA final in '73. So we had 4 years of great ACC basketball. Maryland, North Carolina, Duke, and NC State were constantly beating up on one another, and it was a lot of fun. So anyway, one day Norden calls us all up to his office. Says, I got this letter from a guy named Larry Atkinson down at Skidaway Institute in Savannah, Georgia, and he's got a field experiment out of Africa, and he wants to know if a student in our department is interested. And I got my hand up first, so I was selected. I had no idea what I was getting into, but it sounded like an adventure, and I was up for that. So, turns out the experiment was the GATE experiment, and this was a big program, multinational. There were ships from the Soviet Union, Germany, France, UK, Canada, US, and a number of other countries. And I found out years later that there was a GATE program office here at Goddard. And of course, the aircraft were involved. This is probably a NASA aircraft here. And this is Mission Central, the administration building in Dakar. But the experiment that Larry had proposed was to study gas fluxes. And so he had set up a really sophisticated pumping system coupled with a gas chromatograph, and we'd measure the gas concentrations at various levels and infer the gas exchange with the atmosphere. That's really a hot topic now, but back in the early 70s, it was kind of novel at the time. So anyway, the idea, this is Larry here, years later. And this is the oceanographer, NOAA vessel that we were deployed on. So they only gave us one berth, so Larry was going to go out on the first 3-week segment, and I would go out on the second. And so we got him all set up, and off he went. And I toured around Africa for 3 weeks, and I met him back at the boat after 3 weeks. And I remember he was standing there on the dock. He had short sleeves, shorts, and brown leather wingtip dress shoes. And I looked at him, I said, well, how did things go? And he said, oh, by the way, what's with the shoes? And he said, well, to answer your second question, I forgot my tennis shoes, so I've been wearing these for the past 3 weeks. And to answer your first question, it went downhill from there. And I said, well, what am I going to do, He said, well, you're smart, you'll figure it out. Well, it wasn't quite that bad because the ship's operations really didn't allow him to do the pumping system, automated pumping, so he had to work it out with the marine techs to take water bottles and collect samples that way. So that's what I ended up doing. So anyway, here I am with hair, figuring it out. And of course, the first thing that happens once we left port was some part on the apparatus broke. But fortunately, they had a machine shop on the ship, and so they machined me a new part, and I got it installed, and on I went. So that was my first big cruise. It was a real adventure. So anyway, I got back to NC State after all this, and worked with Norden on defining my dissertation topic. And we got started, and one day I run into him on the stairway, or the stairs of Withers Hall, which was a geoscience building. Norden says, Chuck, I got to talk to you. I said, yeah, what's up, Norden? He says, I'm leaving. I said, you're what? Yeah, I'm leaving. I'm going to go work for NASA. Really? What am I going to do? And he says, well, you got a choice. We can either kind of continue doing the work that you've started, and we'll just do it through correspondence, or you can start working under another one of the professors and start all over. And I said, well, I don't feel like starting over. So we stuck with it, and the topic that we had was related to sediment transport and how surface waves, in fact, the interface with basically sand beds. Beach erosion was a big deal along the Outer Banks, and so we wanted to do something relevant to that. And there was a big civil engineering program that I took a number of courses in for coastal engineering. So this seemed to kind of fit. So the problem that we worked out was a theoretical study along with some experimental studies, a wave tank study and a rotating tank study, to look at the flow right next to the sediment interface. And so we were using a boundary condition that a famous fluid mechanicist had come up with. G.I. Taylor was his name, and it was a slip boundary condition. And so I had this set of coupled partial linear differential equations to solve. And turns out the rotating tank experiment and the wave tank experiment didn't work out at all. They were just beyond our grasp, so we punted that after a while. So it boiled down to just a theoretical study. So I solved this system equation and wrote it up and got it through my committee. And so went into the defense, the oral defense. And I remember this, Norden came down, and I'm in the room, and one of my committee members was the head of the mechanical engineering department. And he was an expert in boundary layer theory, mostly for airfoils, but I remember him sitting there just kind of looking like, what is this all about, you know? And, but I got through the oral part, and they asked me to leave the room, and half an hour later they asked me back and informed me that I'd passed. And all I can say is Norden must have been very persuasive because the head of the mechanical engineering department signed off on it after all. So we eventually published this in Journal of Physical Oceanography, and I was very proud of it. It had 78 equations in it. So as far as I know, this may be one of the least referenced papers ever published in JPO. But no matter. The day after my defense, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I started a postdoc position at Naval Research Lab down in Anacostia. And Norden had kind of set that up for me. My advisor was going to be one of his former students named Davidson Chen. So I got up there and met with Davidson, and he was explaining what their problem was. They were under contract with NASA to ground truth the GEOS 3 radar altimeter estimates of significant wave height, which is sea state basically. And I'm thinking, boy, I've never heard of an altimeter. I have no idea what this is all about. But I did know a little something about surface waves, so he handed me a card deck about this big and said, here. Problem is in this deck somewhere, because they were having no luck getting correlations between the radar estimates and their field measurements. The approach they were taking to derive the ground truth was to fly a P3 on the deck with a CW laser profiling the surface. And they could take that and get the roughness estimate from the profiles of from the laser. Well, that's great if the plane is flying nice and level. And under benign conditions, the plane's kind of undulating a little bit, and you can use a numerical filter to remove the aircraft motion. But if you're flying on the deck with 60 or 80 knot winds and 8 or 9 meter sea states, the plane's jumping all over the place, everybody's lashed in, holding their barf bags, and it's a mess. And so the problem was that the plane motion was overlapping with the signal they were trying to measure. And so the numerical filter was just eliminating everything at a certain point, and so high sea states were just truncated. So I got into the code, and I figured out how this numerical filter worked, and I realized, well, it's not even cutting off where they think it is, so I readjusted the parameters on the filter, backed it way off, and then integrated the inertial navigation accelerometer data, the vertical accelerometer, and double integrated that. And lo and behold, when you get all that done, I don't know if you can see this very well, but you get really nice correlations with the radar estimates. Radar measures sea state in a very different way. It pulses, and if you have a very flat surface, the return pulse is very sharp and peaked. But if it's very rough, then the return pulse starts spreading out. You can correlate that spread in the return pulse with the roughness of the surface, and that's how you get sea state. So it's two very independent measures, and this may have been certainly one of the first, if not the first, validation of radar altimetry sea state measurements. You can take it a little further than that, and if you Doppler shift for the aircraft horizontal motion, you can actually derive very decent power spectra of the surface waves. And here's a comparison with a theoretical spectrum called the Phillips spectrum and the highest sea state measurement we made, and it's a pretty good correlation or comparison with that. So at that point I thought I was done. Actually, my postdoc had run its 2 years, and I was sitting there thinking about, okay, what do I do now? And one day I got a call from a guy from Goddard Space Flight Center named Han-Suk Kim. And Kim had been talking to Norden Wong, and Kim had an ocean color experiment approved for flight on the second space shuttle mission. They had an Earth science payload on the second flight of the space shuttle. And so he needed help with sea truth for his experiment. It had to do with ocean color. And I thought, ocean color, what is that? That sounds kind of soft to me. But anyway, I said, yeah, I'm your man. I can do this. So they went ahead and hired me. But before I get onto that, I did one other study using laser profilometry. This time I was approached by Naval Research Lab down at Stennis. This is 2-3 years later. And they wanted to do an experiment looking at the interaction of surface waves and a current like the Gulf Stream, because when a wave field impacts a strong current, its wavelengths and its amplitudes and its direction get modified. And they wanted to make those measurements and compare it with some theoretical predictions. The Navy had an interest in this. And if you've ever been out on a ship and in rough weather in the Gulf Stream, it makes a big difference whether the waves are flowing or propagating towards with the current or against the current. So anyway, the person's name who approached me was Paul Laviolette. And for my ocean colleagues here, it was through Paul that I met Bob Arnone, who, and that's how our long-term collaboration with NRL Stennis got started. Bob has recently been involved in VIIRS. So anyway, so Paul went off, and Norden and I had designed a flight program and a field program to do this experiment. And so the folks at NRL went off and they conducted it off the Grand Bank somewhere. And then one day Paul walks in, plops some canisters on my desk and says, "Here you are." I said, "Great, what's this?" He says, "This is your data." I said, "Yeah, but what is it?" He says, "It's analog tape." I looked at it and said, "Analog tape? I have no way. I have no idea how I'm going to deal with analog tape." He said, "Well, you'll figure it out." Turns out, fortunately, there was a facility over in Building 23 that could read these tapes, and so they digitized it for me and put it on 9-track digital tapes. And from there, we did the analysis and actually got some fairly nice comparisons with theory by a guy named Longuet Higgins. And we published that in JPO. I don't know how many references that one's gotten, hopefully more than the first one. So anyway, that concluded my work in surface waves, and on to ocean color, whatever that was. So Han-Suk needed field data so he could develop the algorithms so he could do the processing of the ocean color experiment radiometer data. And so I was given one U-2 flight. There was a CZCS prototype instrument called the Ocean Color Scanner that was configured for the U-2, in the NASA U-2. And so they gave me one flight in the spring of 1980. So I called my old friend up, Larry Atkinson, and said, "Hey, this is what's going down. I'm involved in this big program, and I need to sync an aircraft flight over a cruise. Do you have anything going?" And he said, "Yeah, well, we got this big program sponsored by the Department of Energy to study the physics and biology of the South Atlantic Bight. That's the area between Cape Hatteras and Cape Canaveral. And we just so happened to have a cruise scheduled for the time you're talking about. And so we organized it so we'd sync the ship up. The ship would be at a certain location on a certain day at a certain time. And so I went down to Wallops, designed this flight pattern, 5 legs with presumably the ship right in here. And get all ready, day of the flight, the crew's there. Where's the pilot? Well, eventually the pilot comes waltzing in. I think he had been at the Rocket Club late the night before. But anyway, they got him suited up. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, he's walking out, he's got his suit on, he's carrying whatever he carries. And I just said, remember, Jacksonville, Florida, not North Carolina, you know, don't do this to me. But anyway, they get him in the plane, and if you've ever seen a U-2 take off, it's really spectacular. It goes a very short distance, and it goes straight up. And so he disappeared in a flash. So we all retreated back to the hangar. And a few hours later, he comes back. And he gets out, and he walks up to me, and he says, I've never seen anything like that. I said, really? I wonder what he's talking about. Well, it turns out that he flew the perfect pattern. He nailed it dead on. The ship was right in the middle of this center flight line. I don't know how he did it, because they didn't have GPS back then. They had, I guess, inertial navigation, but he nailed it. And it's not a short distance down to Jacksonville from Wallops. So anyway, what they were looking at, the ship was surveying this band of high chlorophyll water along the Gulf Stream front. And it turns out that they had never seen anything like this before, but what happens is the Gulf Stream oscillates and meanders, and when it does, it pumps water up to the surface from the subsurface. It's nutrient-rich water, and it supports very pronounced blooms of phytoplankton. And these waves propagate up the front at a certain phase velocity. And this was the first time they'd ever actually observed it in the field, taking the right kinds of measurements. And for my oceanography friends, the biologist on this cruise was Jim Yoder, and that's how I met Jim Yoder. He later became very prominent in our field, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I got to looking at this, thinking there's got to be more to this than what the U2 data is showing. And so I started asking around about coastal zone color scanner data, because it had been launched maybe a year or so earlier than that. And I was directed to the basement of Building 14, where the archive was. And there I met a guy by the name of John Sisela, and he said, there's the file. And they had a file cabinet with black and white negatives of every scene that they had collected with the CZCS, and there was a light table. And I said, have at it. So I started sorting through this stuff, and it turns out there was a CZCS pass with almost simultaneous with the U2 data, and it was just fortuitous. So I ordered that and a few other really interesting looking negatives, and a few weeks later I get the 9-track tapes. And I think, well, now what am I going to do? I have no way of looking at what's on these tapes. So somebody pointed me to a system called AOIPS, which the Severe Storms branch had developed for all of their image processing and data analysis. So I went over and talked to the person who was managing that facility, David Howe, and his boss, Pete Bracken. And I said, well, this is what I want to do. I want to work on some CZCS data, and nobody here is using this data, and it's a NASA mission and it's a Goddard mission, but nobody's working on it. And they said, this is something we need to support. So they anteed up some time on the system free of charge, because I didn't have any funding. And they also gave me a part-time programmer. Her name was Judy Chen. And so Judy wrote the ingest programs from these tapes, and we displayed them, and I made some black and white prints of these images. And I sent them down to the guys at Skidaway, and they got really excited about it and said, boy, this stuff looks really interesting. So they went to their sponsors, the Department of Energy, and said, we need to give this guy some money to get him started so he can process some of this data, because we think it really benefit the DOE program. So they gave me $50,000 to start. And I had to go through legal, because nobody knew how to take money into Goddard. All we did was release money to others. So I had to work with a lawyer named Larry Watson, who got me set up with a contract and all the legal work to actually receive money from another agency. So with that money, I hired I took some of the time from a programmer who had been working with Hansuk and I for the shuttle mission, bought some of his time, and he wrote all of the level 2 processing code, which is Earth, Sun, satellite geometry, Rayleigh corrections, aerosol corrections. He put that code together. His name was Bill Hart. And Bill wrote the code, and we processed the scene, and we started comparing what the ship measured with the pigment retrievals from the CZCS. And this is what we got. Here's the CZCS data here, this dashed line, and this other line here is the ship data. And I looked at it and I couldn't believe it. I said, oh my goodness. I looked at him and I said, I think we're in business. And this is one of the first validations of the CZCS that were compared with ship data. And so that got us started. We published this paper. This was my first paper using satellite ocean color data in JGR, Journal of Geophysical Research. And this is what the CZCS image looked like. And this was a huge, you could see the bloom goes clear many hundreds of kilometers along the front with a huge bloom here. And the interesting thing about it is this upwelling here is associated with what they call a Gulf Stream filament. It's an instability in the front, and it wraps around. And this whole feature just kind of slowly propagates up the coast along the Gulf Stream front, and you get this core of cold upwelling water right here, and that's what was supporting this bloom. And so this was one of the first papers on this kind of instability in the Gulf Stream front and the plankton blooms that are associated with it. So we published this, and Wayne Asias was at headquarters at this time as on a 2-year position as the ocean biology program manager. And he saw these results and some other results that we had derived from the South Atlantic Bight. And so he started funding me, and that was the first, Wayne gave me my first NASA funding. But some of the other papers that we funded, these are some of the images I found that first day in the basement of Building 14. This was another Gulf Stream filament upwelling here. And then one of the really interesting things was this bloom associated with what they call the Charleston Gyre. And there had been a previous paper describing the hydrology of this, but no satellite information. And so I saw this picture and I thought, oh my goodness, that's amazing. What happens is the Gulf Stream's flowing along the shelf break. It encounters a topographic feature on the bottom, which deflects the stream offshore, and then it later comes back and reattaches to the shelf break. But in this deflection area, it sets up an upwelling favorable circulation, and you get blooms way out on the shelf break this way, and that's called the Charleston Gyre bloom. And that was one of the first papers ever published on that. So, meanwhile, while all this is going on, we're still working on the ocean color experiment, and the shuttle eventually flew. And here some of us are down in Houston, yours truly, Bert Jones and Heinz van der Piepen. He was from the German lab DLR. He was a friend of Hansuk's, and he was on the team. And then, of course, here's the rest of us. But the experiment went off very well. The instrument worked perfectly. But by this time, the community's attention was on the coastal zone color scanner because the Nimbus experiment team had made great strides in getting the algorithms in place for the CZCS, and so that was really where the momentum was. But anyway, the experiment went off perfectly well and got a certificate. There were 7 experiments on this flight, one of which was a synthetic aperture radar. The PI was somebody we all know and love, Charles Elachi, who has been the center director at JPL for ever. So that was kind of interesting. So anyway, cruising along, get another bug. I'm over motorcycles by now, but something else comes in, and it's the Goddard Taekwondo Club. And I think there are some people here who are involved in that. Jim Irons, I think. Remember Jim?
Yeah, I remember when you broke my...
Well, this is Mike Cambariotti, and I was in this club for several years. This is Grandmaster Suyang Cha. He was the real deal. Highly decorated veteran of the Korean War, and he'd come to the United States to promote Taekwondo. He had black belts in at least 3 martial arts. He was a 9th Dan in Taekwondo. Really nice guy, but everybody understood that it was all about RESPECT, and you didn't violate that, or there was a consequence. But anyway, that was one of the things I got into along the way. There's a lot of things here at Goddard, that a lot of clubs, and this is the one I got involved in. Anyway, the next big program I got involved in, once again in collaboration with the Skidaway group, they had been involved in this international program looking at the fisheries off of northwest Spain. Along that coast there are a number of small fjord-like structures called Rios. And in these Rios they have major aquacultures of mussels. And so here's a raft. They have all these rafts out in the embayment, and they're ropes, and they grow mussels on them, and they harvest, and it's a big market for these. And so they were studying the carrying capacity of the Rios to support this aquaculture, plus the other fisheries off the coast there. And so they asked me to get involved because they wanted to get some of the satellite imagery to get a better picture of what was going on. And this had been going on for several years. But here are some of the players. Ken Tenor was the PI. The time this was taken, he was the director at the Chesapeake Biological Lab down at Solomon's. Some of the other players, Jim Yoder, Mike Roman. Mike, I believe, is the director at Horn Point Environmental Lab down at Cambridge now. That's part of the University of Maryland system, like CBL is. But anyway, it was a really interesting study. This is one of the small vessels they did research on within the Rios. They used bigger vessels when they went offshore. But it was really a great study. What we found is this is a map of the coastline. Here are the Rios. Here's where all these mussel fisheries are within these Rios. And they do surveys off shore here to look at the upwelling dynamics. And what the satellite data showed was that the upwelling really wasn't happening so much along this coast. It was always happening between these 2 big capes. And this is a CZCS image of the pigments showing a big bloom there, simultaneous with this cruise. Well, the cruise missed the bloom altogether because they didn't know that the bloom was happening further north, typically. And then this is an AVHR, sea surface temperature image, showing the cold waters off this area where the bloom is. So that was kind of a revelation. And we eventually published a paper in JGR explaining the dynamics of why the bloom tends to happen here rather than other places. And basically, when you've got a geometry like that, the wind can be blowing any number of directions and it's forcing an upwelling there. So I mentioned that we had started putting the software to package together, Judy, Bill, and I. And with Wayne's support, the software package just kept expanding. And eventually, we called it CPAC. Judy coined the term. It's not an acronym, but it became a very large package, ran on the VAX system, which were pretty common back in the early 80s. With a particular image display system called an I²S. And it became very large, and I had lots of visitors coming at this point because there were only maybe 2 or 3 places in the country you could go and actually work on CZCS data. And we had one of the few facilities that was capable of that. Early on, we were still using AOIP system, and I remember one summer I had 3 visitors. One very senior person from the University of Washington named Carl Bonza. He was studying the Arabian Sea. I had a graduate student from Scripps named Vittorio Barali, and he was working in the Northern Adriatic. And then I had Gene Feldman, who was studying the Equatorial Pacific. And they were all here at once, and of course I was doing my work in the South Atlantic Bight. And it was really interesting watching the 3 of those guys negotiate on who would get daytime access and who had to work at night. And about once a week I'd get a call from Fritz Hassler, who was one of the PIs in the Severe Storms branch. He said, "McClain, what are you guys doing? The system's at a standstill." And I said, "Oh, I'll find out, Fritz, don't worry." Well, I knew what was going on. My 3 visitors had figured out how to load up batch jobs, and they just had the machine queued up to the max all the time. And so anyway, it was a kind of interesting summer, but Gene got his degree, Vittorio got his degree, and Carl got his publication on the winter monsoon in the northern Arabian Sea. So anyway, this package kept expanding, and then when Jim Yoder served his first tour of duty at NASA headquarters as program manager, he asked me if we could port this system to a PC-based system, and we looked into it, and sure enough we could. And that became PC CPAC. And we distributed that through the Cosmic system, which was kind of the warehouse for all NASA software, and so everybody could go and purchase or get the data, get the software from them, and then we gave them configuration. So for a few $1,000s, you could set up a fairly capable system for processing AVHR and CZCS data. I remember we benchmarked it against a VAX one time, and with the YTEC accelerator chip on the motherboard, we could process a CZCS scene in half the time a Microvax 2 could do it. So anyway, a couple other enhancements. We teamed up with Mary Desjardins, who was the PI for a system called GEMPAC, which was the severe storms analysis package. They use the same hardware and software configuration, so we could link those 2 packages so we could take meteorological and hydrographic data and overlay it on the satellite image from the AVHR and CZCS. And that was really cool. That really helped the interpretation of the satellite data a lot. And then Chet Kablinski suggested that I go talk to the folks at the NASA Climate Data System about getting data sets into the system that we could use. And so I went over and I met somebody named Lola Olson, who was working in that system, and we went together on a proposal to the Director's Discretionary Fund back then, the DDF. And I remember giving the pitch. At that time, you had to actually present to the center director. And I think it was somebody named Townsend. Was there a center director named Townsend way back when? Yeah. So I'm presenting, and he's giving me all this hard time about this will never work. This is a bunch of bunk. And I really got hot under the collar, you know, and I was arguing with him. And I finally got through my pitch, and I went away, and I said, well, that's a disaster. Well, he funded it. So we started ingesting all these data sets. We hired a full-time programmer, and we ingested all kinds of meteorological data and put it into CDFs, which would feed right into GEMPAC and CPAC. And so that was pretty slick. This system was laid the groundwork for another system that we developed called the CWIS Data Analysis System, CDAS. And it was the impetus for that because when we went into the CWIS program, we said, look, we're going to make sure that the user community has the capability of processing and working with CWIS data as soon as it comes in from the first day. And so we got funding to do that, and so CPAC laid the groundwork for CDAS, which today remains the primary community standard processing system for all ocean color data, including CWIS, MODIS, VIRS, MERIS. It's really expanded in terms of the capabilities it has in terms of the number of missions it supports. And the team here at Goddard still supports that, and it's a very important and popular software package that we provide to the international community. So the next big thing that happened is when Wayne finished his tour of duty at headquarters, he came to Goddard, and he had a vision that we should process the entire CZCS data set. And I remember he told me that was his concept, and I just looked at him and said, how are we going to do that? Never worked with such a volume of data. And, he persuaded the Nimbus project office to support it, and talked to Bob Evans down at the University of Miami into teaming with us. And Bob had a lot of experience with big systems, processing lots of AVHR data and things like that. And so Bob pretty much knew how to set up a system to do this. And then Gene graduated in the fall of 1985, so we got him hired here. We got it all set up, and we went about processing this data set. Took us almost 5 years, 30,000 9-track tapes to ingest and copy over to optical platters, 90,000 scenes. We QC'd the data one scene at a time. Very labor intensive. We didn't have many automated capabilities at that time, but we got it done, and basically this work laid the groundwork for a CZCS follow-on, which was CWIFs and ocean color capabilities in MODIS. And we finished that and published some papers, and basically that's how we got CWIFs. Jim Yoder and some other people, Marlon Lewis and Greg Mitchell, rotated in and out of headquarters, and they basically used this data set to argue for a follow-on mission, which we eventually got as a data buy, which was CWIFs. So that's pretty much gets me to CWIFs and all the fits and starts I had getting started, but there's been a number of other things I've been involved in over the years since then. I don't have time to go into all of that, but anyway, it's been a great experience here, and I guess that's kind of the end of my acknowledgments. I have a lot of people to thank for my career. I've gotten a lot of help along the way, a lot of mentoring, a lot of people who provided funding at critical times, who gave me opportunities when I didn't know where I was going to go next, and here they are. Of course, there's been many since the CWIS, but this is at least for the period that I've discussed today. And so I guess that's about an hour, right?
Good, good.
Oh. Before I take questions, I'll show one more slide.
Okay.
This is to tie it back to agriculture. Okay. We've come a long way in the last 100 years. 100 years ago, this was what they used. This is called a thrashing machine. This is a steam-powered tractor. Probably very expensive at the time, very labor-intensive, hot, dirty work. It took a crew to do this, and usually what people would do is communities would team together, and all the men would work in teams, and they would help each other harvest. And at the end of the harvest season, they'd have a big banquet. And it was slow and somewhat dangerous. A lot of these had open belt systems, and it was not uncommon when I was growing up to find people with missing digits or even thumbs. This is what they use today. Oh, by the way, that's my grandfather and his two sisters. This is not ours, by the way. This is a neighbor's. But I got to ride in it not too long ago. This is the cockpit. And it is very expensive. It's a one-man operation if you got enough logistical support. Fast, it requires special training. You have to go to school to learn how to run this thing. And it's got AC, GPS, stereo, a yield monitor, so you can actually map the yield on a field of how many bushels per acre you're getting. Auto steering, if you want to buy that option, if your fields are big enough. And one guy can sit in this, harvest hundreds of acres a day, and never break a sweat. It's pretty amazing. And anyway, we've come a long way. So when I go back to Missouri, I usually go in the spring and the fall, work on the farm a little bit. But I get to watch the harvest every September, and that's pretty cool. So anyway, questions?
Okay, some question or comments? Yes, please.
A quick question, Chuck. It seems like a lot of the things that you were able to do at Goddard, where you will go to someone and say, "Hey, I need some help. Can you support me doing this?" And things like that. In the current full cost accounting system, would that be possible?
I doubt it. No, I mean, you think about it. When I was able to walk over to building 23 and just walk into a facility and say, "I need some help reading these analog tapes," the guy said, "No problem. Yeah, I can do that." And he just did it. He didn't have to worry about a WBS to charge to. And the same with the AOWIPs. I mean, the Severe Storms branch, and I want to thank them for helping me get started. All the manpower was free. It was just the funding to buy the system and buy the contract support for it. Very different scenario. Yeah, I think it's much tougher now.
Okay, the last comment. All right.
David.
So Chuck, given speed and everything, how long would it take to redo that CCCS data set as it's in now?
I think less than a half an hour, isn't it? Yeah. we can blow through it in less than a half an hour. When we started the CWIS system, we were running on, it was originally configured for Microvax 2s and with a 10-to-1 throughput, 10 days to 1. But then we jumped to Unix-based workstations, and I think we're at many thousands of days per day now. Isn't that right, John? What's our throughput basically on a reprocessing?
9,000.
Yeah. So we could go through the CWIS processing probably in a day or so now. Big difference. In only, 30 years? 5 years to less than a day. so yeah. Bob.
Give yourself 20 years and will your processing system look something like your steam-driven tractor?
It already has. Yeah. Well, I remember the first 286-based PC I had. I thought that was the cat's meow, but those are long gone.
Do fence posts go any faster now than they used to?
Say what?
Do fence posts go any faster than they used to?
Well, I was going to show a slide on fencing. No. When I go back, I usually am in the mode of replacing fence. We rent out our pasture. The family still owns the family farm. My grandparents' farm's still in the family. So I go back and we rent out pasture to a local veterinary. The last thing you want is cows in the road, because it's a paved road that goes right through the middle of the farm, and people drive like bats out of you-know-where. And the last thing you want is a cow in the middle of the road. Or cows are very inquisitive, curious animals, and the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And the last thing you want is your neighbor calling you up saying, what are your cows doing eating my soybeans, So I have to be, been replacing fence for years, but I had a really good picture of a couple of my favorite plants. It seems like anything that grows in a fence row either causes a rash or has thorns. And so I got some good shots of what they call multiflora rose, which is awful stuff. It's and also black locust, which has clusters of thorns about this long. And so I had a picture of one that had grown up around a T-post, and it's still standing. That's not one I decided to cut down. I left it in place. It would do a wonder on a chainsaw. But it's a lot of fun. At least at the end of the day, you can look back and say, yeah, that's what I did today, But when it's a drought, Pounding those T-posts in by hand will wear you out real quick. But when it's soft, I can use the tractor with a scoop to push them down, and it's a lot easier. So yeah, a lot of fun.
Okay, so let's thank Shaq for one.